He persevered. He persevered. He managed to persevere. He didn't pass out. The family of Pastor Charles Stanley finally speaks out about his final days. It's not attractive. Charles Stanley spent half a century preaching to millions about the importance of family values. However, his own family was disintegrating behind closed doors. His spouse filed for divorce. The church was deserted by his son. His daughter saw everything go apart. They are finally speaking now, years after he passed away in 2023. You'll be shocked by what they disclosed about his last days. The man at home was not the same as the man in the pulpit, and his relationship with his kid was completely transformed by the final 3 words he ever said. On September 25, 1932, Charles Stanley was born in Dry Fork, a small Virginian village. In the midst of the Great Depression, millions of people felt despondent, families were going hungry, and jobs were disappearing. Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, his parents, were struggling to make ends meet. Blocks of red lines extended. Overnight, homes were lost. Raising a child at those times was the worst. But in some way, that tumultuous beginning served as the foundation for one of the most influential voices in Christian ministry. Everything changed 9 months after Charles was born. At the age of 29, his father unexpectedly passed away. He was present one day and then absent the next. Just a name and stillness. No farewell, no memories left. During the worst economic downturn in U.S. history, his mother, Rebecca, was left to raise a baby by herself. Charles never got over the feeling of abandonment. He frequently talked about having a hole in his heart as a child, wondering who his father was and what type of guy he would have been if he had followed his example. His later discussion of God as the Father who never departs, never forgets, and never turns away was influenced by that desire. Rebecca remarried when Charles was 9 years old. She believed that by providing her son with the father figure he had lost, she was acting morally. However, that choice almost brought them both to ruin. John Hall, her new husband, had a terrible temper and was an alcoholic. Almost instantly, the horror started. Rebecca became aware that she had married into a falsehood 2 weeks after the wedding. Paul had been duped by her own family. They were aware of his abuse. They assured her that if he married, he would change. He didn't. Charles was much more terrified. He saw his mother being strangled by his stepfather. Every night, he shut the door to his bedroom. He occasionally even put a loaded rifle next to his bed as a precaution. He grew up in a conflict area. He was not only scarred by the tragedy, it shaped him. It taught him that faith is necessary for survival, and that the only person you can genuinely trust is God, not other people. Charles sought solace in the church amidst the turmoil at home. He has Pentecostal roots. George Washington Stanley, his grandpa, was a founding member of the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church in Dry Fork. Charles absorbed the ferocious preaching, clamorous prayers, and intense passion that accompanied Pentecostal worship from his parents, who were enthusiastic members. He would hide out in the church basement on the hardest evenings at home. He prayed out there, pleading with God for peace while sobbing and yelling. He discovered that praying was more than just whispering. It was pouring out his heart. That Pentecostal fire remained with him even after he converted to Christianity. It influenced the way he led, communicated, and preached. At 17, a life-altering event occurred. Charles traveled to Siler City, North Carolina, to see his grandfather. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a pastor. Too young, too shattered, too weak, he thought. However, his grandfather handed him a single line that would serve as his life's compass. "Charles, you should flee if God commands you to poke your head through that brick wall. He is responsible for creating the whole." It came to him like a thunderclap. His fundamental belief became clear after that. Follow God's will and let him handle the fallout. It was more than a motto. It was a matter of survival. Obedience served as his compass when life provided no answers. Charles started his official education in the 1950s. He attended Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. After beginning his education at the University of Richmond, Bible colleges were flourishing at the time, with enrollment having tripled since 1945. Christianity was establishing a fresh voice on television and radio while the globe underwent rapid change. In 1949, Billy Graham began his crusades. Evangelism was spreading across the country. Charles jumped right in, learning Hebrew, Greek, preaching, and theology. He was studying more than simply the Bible. He was learning how to put it into people's lives and make it real. Charles was only 25 years old in 1957, but he was already teaching, preaching, and serving as a pastor at Fruitland Baptist Church in North Carolina. Despite being a small church with only 150 members in a mountain town, it was just what he needed. He was a full-time preacher and taught evangelism and homiletics at the local Bible Institute. His weekly pay was only $75. He didn't care though. He was engaged in his passion. He was learning how to talk, lead, and connect with people who are facing real-life challenges. Many of his members struggled with poverty and uncertainty as manufacturing workers or farmers. He did not just preach to them, he offered them hope. At the age of 26, he received his official Baptist ministerial ordination in 1958. That was a really young age. Charles was prepared, even though most pastors were ordained in their 30s. He had the ideal timing. Evangelism on television was booming. Every channel featured Billy Graham. Oral Roberts had just started his own ministry on television. Charles would be next. In the same year, he received his ordination certificate, which authorized him to lead churches, get married, and perform baptisms. More significantly, though, it signaled the beginning of a brand new ministry that would eventually serve millions of people worldwide. Charles moved around a lot between 1959 and 1968. First to Miami, Florida, then to Bartow, Florida, and last to Fairborn, Ohio. Every church had fresh difficulties. He was the leader of a church close to a large Air Force post in Fairborn. Due to the Cold War buildup, the town was expanding quickly. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he served as a pastor in Miami, when his church's membership doubled from 400 to over 800. Nevertheless, he continued to move despite the success. By 1968, he had taken a smaller church in the sleepy 12,000-person city of Bartow. For Charles, it was an opportunity to create something tangible, but most would consider it a step backward. He desired to establish strong roots and begin anew. That restless time wasn't a failure, it was a training session. He was honing his craft, picking up knowledge from every community, and anticipating the turning point. Charles Stanley didn't know what type of conflict he was getting into when he initially entered Baptist Atlanta in 1969. The church was divided. Politics and theology were the causes of faction warfare. The associate pastor, Stanley, was standing squarely in the center of it. One meeting became so heated that he was actually punched. He didn't leave though. He spent 2 grueling years there. He put up with the hatred, the whisper campaigns, the strain. Then October 1971 arrived. To determine whether Stanley should be appointed senior pastor, the church held a standing vote that day. When the votes were counted, the answer was obvious, despite the heated and raw emotions in the room. Indeed, Stanley was now 39 years old and the 16th pastor of one of the most powerful churches in the South. However, there was a cost. Many of his opponents left permanently, leaving a church that was broken and bruised, but at last prepared to go on. He took an even greater risk. A year later, Stanley introduced the Chapel Hour on WX-9 and Wonk 46, 2 local Atlanta TV stations. In 1972, the show lasted only 30 minutes. It wasn't particularly impressive, but it garnered enough attention from 16,000 local viewers. In the background, Christian networks were looking for voices that seemed realistic and useful. Stanley's straightforward Bible instruction was appropriate. The Christian Broadcasting Network made contact in 1978. They required content as they constructed a new satellite system. Yes, Stanley replied. His viewership grew from 16,000 in Atlanta to a national audience in just 1 week. Along with a completely new logo, the program was renamed Inoch with Dr. Charles Stanley. It was broadcast on television in practically every major American city by the early 1980s. Then it spread over the world. By the end, 150 countries were broadcasting Stanley's message in 114 different languages. But cameras weren't the first part of his media empire. Classrooms were the first. 5 years before he made his broadcast debut, in 1966, Stanley established the George Mueller Christian School in Miami. At the time, he continued to serve as a pastor at First Baptist Miami. Education was not the only purpose of the school. It has to do with morals. It was named in honor of George Mueller, a well-known Christian leader who provided orphan care based only on faith and prayer. It was that name. Stanley thought that religion should be incorporated into daily life, particularly into the upbringing and education of children. He was beginning a school, juggling school, a church, and completing his master's degree all at once. That demonstrated the sort of determination that would come to characterize his national ministry. In 1968, he traveled from Miami to Bartow, Florida, and by 1969, he was on his way to Atlanta. However, those initial years demonstrated something. Stanley's thoughts extended beyond Sunday sermons. He had tremendous ideas, and that thought continued. First Baptist Atlanta had about 5,000 members when Stanley took charge. That number tripled during the 1990s. The church required additional room. He made a contentious choice in 1997. He relocated the entire church to the Dunwoody suburb after selling the landmark Midtown Atlanta property. 3,000 people could be accommodated in the new structure. It was sleek, contemporary, and future-ready. Stanley, however, wasn't solely concerned with the stats. He created programs. The Passion Play, a dramatic recreation of Jesus' last week, was one of the most well-known. It involved hundreds of volunteers and operated from 1977 till 2011. The church was transformed into a media, outreach, and ministry machine under Stanley's direction. After over 50 years, First Baptist Atlanta was more than just a church when he resigned in 2020. The institution was a national one. Perhaps the most significant shift, however, occurred in 1978 when his ministry gained wings thanks to technology. Everything changed that year when the Chapel Hour was transformed into In Touch by CBN's satellite network. The ascent wasn't gradual. Stanley's visage was beaming in American homes within a week. For a preacher in those days, such exposure was unprecedented. Stanley, however, didn't mind being in the spotlight. He accepted it. He formally declared it in 1982. He established In Touch Ministries as a separate nonprofit organization that allowed him complete freedom to grow. And he did. In the same year, radio syndication got underway. In the US alone, he soon reached more than 115 million households. He didn't stop there, though. He used technology that virtually no one else was employing to push into the most isolated regions of the earth. He developed an obsession with invention. Stanley thought that technology was necessary, not merely helpful. He aimed to reach everyone, including those living in powerless communities. In order to help those without internet, energy, or a church, he established Messenger Lab, which consists of 8 distinct solar-powered audio devices. The New Testament, Psalms, Proverbs, and 65 of his sermons could all be played in 2 languages on a single device. Throughout 1 million messenger gadgets were distributed throughout time. We are told that the overall worth is more than $26 million. They also visited more than one area. These gadgets made it to Antarctica as well as every other continent. Stanley's sermons, meanwhile, were broadcast on over 4,000 radio, television, and satellite stations. He spoke 127 different languages. He appeared on podcasts, digital platforms, mobile apps, and more. He did this because he thought it was the best time in history to share the gospel. He was also a political lightning rod in addition to being a media behemoth. Stanley was elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1984. In the history of the denomination, it was one of the most contentious periods. Biblical inherency, or whether the Bible was entirely true in all respects, including science, was the subject of a full-fledged civil war within the SBC. It was dubbed the Conservative Renaissance by conservatives. The moderates referred to it as a takeover. Stanley narrowly won the presidency with 52% of the vote. However, it was sufficient. From 1984 until 1986, he held 2 terms. He oversaw the Peace Committee that was established in 1985 to end the conflict during that time. The report of the committee was 6,450 words long, following 15 difficult meetings, and it validated the opinions of Stanley and other conservatives. The SBC took a different, more theologically conservative tack after that. Stanley was in the midst of that transformation too. Charles Stanley continued to advance, starting with a Miami school in 1966 and continuing through a church fight in 1971 and a satellite empire in the 1980s. Charles Stanley was at the height of his public career in February 1988. The National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame had recently inducted him. It was a momentous occasion. In America, his sermons were being heard in over 115 million homes, and In Contact with Dr. Charles Stanley has established itself as a mainstay on Christian television and radio. He was no ordinary preacher. He was a leader influencing the direction of Christian media and the public face of a movement. At home, however, something far more sinister was taking place as the rest of the world celebrated him. Stanley went to Kansas City for a ministry event in 1989. A year later, he was in his hotel room praying when he looked out the window and saw dozens of satellite dishes on rooftops nearby. He said that God sent him a message at that very moment. The gospel would be spread globally in this manner. He thought about Psalm 67 too. Spread the word about your ability to save lives all over the world. It turned out to be a pivotal occasion. His sermons would later be aired on more than 4,000 networks worldwide and translated into 127 languages. However, as the message spread, the individual who sent it was disintegrating. Anna, his wife, had been feeling more and more alone. Charles spent more and more time on the expansion of his ministry and church. She wasn't angry when she once remarked, "He chose his priorities, and I have not been one of them." Her words came from years of suffering. Anna had completely ceased going to his church services by the early 1990s. It was all witnessed by their son Andy, who would go on to become a megachurch pastor. The icy quiets, the increasing separation, and the gradual dissolution of a marriage that had endured for almost 40 years. Anna ultimately filed for divorce in June 1993. Even though she only used A.J. Stanley and not her full name, it was obvious who it was. According to the documents, their marriage was irreparably damaged. Evangelical groups blew up. This was Charles Stanley, the man who gave a Sunday sermon on the importance of family values. His own marriage was now publicly disintegrating. The outcry was swift. There were pastors who ignored him. Others called for him to leave the pulpit. The divorce wasn't the only thing that shocked me. It was the picture. The exact thing Stanley was now accused of failing was the foundation of his reputation. However, the tale did not finish abruptly. At one time, Anna retracted the petition in the hopes of a reconciliation. She refiled in 1995 when that failed. The Stanleys were legally married, emotionally estranged, and under public scrutiny for 7 years, leaving them in a state of agonizing ambiguity. His sermons were discontinued by Christian radio stations. Stanley continued to speak week after week, despite private pleas from some church officials for him to step down. It was defiance, not simply perseverance. It did not amuse the Southern Baptist Convention. It had been presided over by Stanley. They were now demanding that he resign. Years before, he had even declared to his own congregation that he would quit the ministry if he ever got divorced. He was still behind the pulpit and was either divorced or very nearly so. His son Andy was among the staff members that quit. On May 11, 2000, the divorce was finalized. The case was declared formally uncontested by the judge's signature. Charles was 67. 50 languages were broadcasting his teachings. However, he was no longer a husband at that time. Once the epitome of Christian family values, the man had lost his own family. Until her passing in 2014, Anna would stay unmarried. Charles didn't get married again. As long as he didn't take another wife, he was permitted to remain as pastor by church bylaws. Shortly after the final documents were finalized, he spoke to his congregation. The revelation came after he calmly stated, "God has assured me I'm where He wants me to be, doing what He has called me to do." He received great support from his church. He was retained by the Board of Deacons by a vote of 35-3. Stanley made a shocking statement in a subsequent interview. "I never felt as though I had truly separated from her. She requested it. I answered it." Depending on your point of view, that one line encapsulated the depth of conviction or denial. However, not everybody was in agreement. Years before, Andy Stanley had quietly left First Baptist Atlanta. He didn't simply walk out of the church. He departed from the whole dynasty. The pulpit was to be passed down to him. Rather, he separated and started his own church. He assembled a group of individuals and established North Point Community Church in 1995. It was more than a brand new structure. It was an entirely new way of thinking. It was a direct remark at everything his father's ministry stood for. Atlanta doesn't need another church. What it needs is a safe space for the unchurched. By the end of the first year, more than 4,000 people were attending North Point, and today, the church serves more than 43,000 people in several locations. Their feud became legendary, and Christian media couldn't stop talking about it. It was an empire in and of itself, and it had nothing to do with Charles Stanley. The father had one of the largest ministries in the world, and the son built one of the largest churches in the nation, and they weren't even talking. For whatever reason, a mental illness, an affair, jealousy, control issues, or something else entirely, the silence between the father and son came to represent everything that was wrong with evangelical leadership. Two men who taught forgiveness but were unable to extend it to one another tried weekly sessions, counseling, and brutal honesty before they finally found a solution. "When do I give up on my dad?" Andy asked the counselor one day. They started talking again slowly and painfully after the counselor's response. "When your heavenly father gives up on you." One lunch meeting changed everything, and Charles stated, "I don't want us to end up like all those other fathers and sons." "Me neither, Dad," Andy replied quietly. By 2013, Andy's North Point Community Church had expanded to roughly 30,000 members spread across 5 campuses, making it the second largest church in the U.S. What's even more amazing is that his father, Charles Stanley, who had previously felt abandoned by Andy's departure, stood at his own pulpit and publicly and passionately praised him. In private, Charles acknowledged that those words didn't come easily, that the scars were still fresh, but he said them nonetheless. That same Charles, who had earlier made subtle barbs at Andy during sermons, now proudly told his congregation about Andy's aspirations to start a church and even gave his blessing. He knew he had a front row seat growing up, and Andy never forgot that blessing. Years ago, they could barely speak, but as time went on, they were able to preach for each other's churches. The father who had once viewed his son as a rebel now saw him as a partner. Charles, who had been president of the Southern Baptist Convention and had led First Baptist Atlanta for more than 50 years, was learning from one of America's most influential preachers. However, as he watched his son guide a new generation, everything slowed down and he was unable to do much. Every time Andy came to visit, he would kneel next to that chair and they would talk, and then Charles would say, "Pray for me." This became their new rhythm, a rhythm of healing. He spent his days in a large leather chair, his body too weak to carry him anymore, but his mind still sharp, his heart still burning. That chair became a sacred space, a symbol of peace between two men who had once been at odds. Charles no longer thundered from the pulpit or stood on stages, but he found something just as powerful in that chair through quiet prayers. According to Andy, who said those visits were priceless beyond words, the divorce between Charles and Andy's mother, Anna, had shattered more than just a marriage. It had shattered their bond as father and son. Charles acknowledged that he was afraid of what might happen between them. There was a time when their dinners were tense and silent. They would sit in restaurants knowing they should talk, but not knowing how. He once said to Andy, "We've both seen what happens to fathers and sons who go through something like this, and I don't want that to happen to us." This fear drove them to rebuild gradually over the course of almost 25 years, until the words "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy" came. The source of a word determines its weight. Charles Stanley could have stuck to old arguments. Andy had taken bold theological stances, ones that upset feathers. He challenged traditions. He didn't just mean it, he wanted Andy to know it. He said it more than once. It eventually became a habit. But instead of publicly reprimanding him or taking offense at Andy's opinions on the Old Testament or LGBTQ+ issues, Charles repeatedly uttered those 7 words, and they were able to heal something that no sermon could. Their last exchange was a scene straight out of a storybook. Just 3 days before Charles's death, on Saturday night, April 15, 2023, Andy paid him a visit as usual, expecting the same routine: kneel next to the chair, say a prayer, and hear a quiet thank you. But something changed this time. As Andy stood up to go, Charles asked, "May I pray for you?" He had only ever done that once. The last words his father would ever say to Andy were, "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." He prayed, then repeated the words, "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." Charles Stanley died at 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18, 2023, at the age of 90. His ministry had begun when he was just 14. His sermons were translated into 114 languages, and he preached for 66 years, leading First Baptist Atlanta for 50 of those years before stepping down in 2020 to become pastor emeritus. The mission continued after he reached every continent through 2,800 radio and TV outlets in 150 countries. His In Touch ministries continued and continue today. His daughter, Becky Stanley Brorson, rarely spoke in public but lived through it all, the highs and lows of ministry and family life, observing her father's commitment to his calling and the toll it took. Their mother, Anna, had filed for divorce in 1993. It wasn't final until 2000. She later claimed that Charles wouldn't acknowledge that their marriage was failing. Becky witnessed her parents' public breakup, but she remained close, was present when the last chapter was written, and her name was listed next to Andy's in the obituary. In Touch Ministries didn't simply survive. Beginning as the Chapel Hour in 1972, it expanded into one of the most influential evangelical networks in history, reaching people in 150 countries, broadcasting on more than 200 to 800 stations, translating into 114 languages, and reaching 500 radio stations and 300 TV networks in the United States alone. Thanks to digital outreach and satellite, even remote tribal communities heard Charles Stanley preach. When he stepped down, his sermons remained constant, preserved, and prepared for the next generation. However, none of that adequately conveyed the contradiction at the core of his life. Despite his teachings on family values, Charles Stanley was unable to prevent his own family from disintegrating. His wife left, and his son once felt deceived. His daughter witnessed firsthand the price of a worldwide ministry. He was raised by an alcoholic stepfather and preached about healing, but he had to learn how to do it himself. His fierce and unyielding survival instinct made him a powerful preacher, but it also made him difficult to get along with. But that paradox didn't lessen the impact of his message. It brought it to life.